Thank you all for joining us at our program we are calling Yemen at a Crossroads. And I certainly think there's ample evidence to suggest we are really at an inflection point in this seemingly endless conflict in Yemen, a moment when I think it's a lot of elements seem to be coming together to suggest maybe there's momentum building towards what we hope will be a negotiated end to the war and move us away from this morass. And I think to some extent we can trace this back a little bit to June when the UAE announced it was going to draw down its forces in Yemen. And that set off a chain of, I think, decisions and changes in calculations on the part of the parties to the conflict as to what was within the realm of the possible and what they might strive to achieve in the time they had in front of them. We certainly saw then, as a result of the UAE decision, the deep fissures revealed themselves in the coalition in the south as the Southern Transition Council came into conflict with the Hadi government. We certainly saw, in terms of the Houthis' own behavior, they became quite emboldened, increasing the ferocity and the frequency of attacks into Saudi territory. And then, of course, there were the external events with the attacks on the ships in the Persian Gulf, and then the attacks on the Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, which really unnerved the external parties, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in the conflict and forced them to recalculate exactly how their interests were being served or not by their continued participation in Yemen. So our mission today is to try to unpack all of these different events and see what exactly we believe are the implications that we can assess from these events and maybe what the outcomes might be now that we've gotten to this point in time. And certainly one of the questions we're going to ask ourselves is, can we think about the parties to what we might refer to as the larger war, the big war in Yemen, actually coming to terms, and will that help resolve the smaller conflicts that we know are within kind of the wheels within the wheel, if you will, in Yemen that continues to flummox policymakers and analysts. And I have with me today to help me in this task three excellent analysts and observers of things Yemeni for quite a long period of time. I'll start to my far right, where Charles Schmitz sits, and he is a professor of geography at Towson University, just outside of Baltimore, a longtime observer of events in Yemen, and a longtime associate and friend of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies, one of my favorite institutions in Sana'a. So thank you very much for coming down in this rain as well, Charles. Next to Charles is Elana DeLozier, research fellow in the Bernstein Program on Gulf and Energy Policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Her research focuses on Yemen, the Gulf states, and nuclear proliferation. So Elana, welcome to you as well. And of course, always a joy to have Abdulghani al-Iryani join us. Abdulghani's been here before. We try to get him back whenever he's within reach, and he's been kind enough to come and join us today. He's a Yemeni political and development consultant doing a lot of work, he tells me now, with the UNDP in Yemen. That's fabulous work, so keep it up. We need all the help we can get. Also, one of my very favorite and one of the most astute analysts I know on developments within his country and within the countries neighboring Yemen as well. So with that in mind, I think what I'll do is, first of all, I'll let you know, we'll talk for a while up here ourselves. We will then open it up for questions from the floor. I know we're live streaming today, so if anyone out there who is not with us physically would like to submit a question, please do so via Twitter. We would love to hear from you, and I look forward to getting questions from all of you at some point or another. So with that in mind, let me just turn first, if I may, to Abdulghani. And we've seen a lot of news lately about overtures regarding perhaps a way to end the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen. The Houthis have offered to suspend their attacks inside Saudi territory in exchange for a suspension of the air attacks over Yemeni territory. My question, I guess, is do you think that the Saudi leadership is prepared and politically able at this point to take a step such as that would move towards a negotiated end? Or do you think they need to show a decisive victory in Yemen to satisfy the political demands that are placed on them and make sure that Mohammed bin Salman looks to be the determined leader he wants to be seen as, for one point? And then secondly, I wanted to ask you another question about that. And if, in fact, it is the case that the Saudis need to do something more than negotiate their way out of this, How do they come to grips with this business in the south, which has been flummoxing them for some time now? We understand today that what we thought was an agreement pending between the Hadi government and the STC has not been signed. So the Saudis were counting on that, I think, to kind of put the flames out in the south. That seems to be not the case yet. So now that the UAE has left the south, what does that do to the Saudis' ability to come to grips with now at the north and the south both? That may be a lot for one question, but I'll repeat it if you like.
Thanks, Steve. Let me start with the south first because it's easier and faster. The Emirates has not left the south. The Emirates has organized its affairs in the south to the point where they can go fishing. They have decided that it is not necessary for them to be physically present, boots in the ground, because the forces that they have organized and trained are now competent and able to achieve the objectives that have been set for them, or they have set for themselves. The Saudis pressured the Emiratis in the south, but unfortunately they don't have the tools to make that pressure produce positive results for the Saudis. If they pressure the Emiratis to let Hadi and his forces go back to Aden, they'll be basically producing the formula for an explosion. There's no reason for Hadi's forces to return to Aden, when in fact the conflict has nothing to do with the overall larger conflict between the internationally recognized government and Ansar Allah. And in fact, the establishment of STC mitigates a serious imbalance in the representation of the South that had the potential of undermining any peace agreement. The southwestern part of Yemen was poorly represented. The representation of that demographic was monopolized by Hadi and his tribal allies, to the exclusion of the majority of the population of the south, the Lahj and Vala population, who were not being represented properly. So I think the stable situation is for STC to control the territory where its demographic base is, and Hadi to remain at the territory where his demographic base is. That's the only stable possibility in the south. Going to the Saudi situation, I don't think that the Saudis have any reason to contemplate a decisive victory at this time, or anywhere in the near future. They have indicated over the past 12 months that they're willing to go to peace, but they needed to knock the Houthis a peg or two, knock them down a peg or two before they extend the hand of peace. And they tried. And the trials, the three attempts were total failure. In fact, it was humiliating for the Saudis what happened in Qataf, where thousands of men were taken prisoner, and a whole bunch of Saudi officers and soldiers were also taken prisoner. The incompetence in managing their military campaigns, I think, is indicative of the internal problems that plague the Saudi system. And I don't think that they are considering the possibility of victory anytime soon. However, they don't have to win to be able to extend the peace, the hand of peace to the Ansar Allah. The fact of the matter is, in Kuwait, during the negotiations in Kuwait, there was an agreement between the Saudis and Ansar Allah that Saudi is not the enemy. The Yemenis are divided and they're fighting each other. And Saudi can come in to sponsor peace negotiations amongst Yemenis. That's a face-saving exit that should be looked at very seriously at this time, because the alternatives to that, military victory, unlikely, highly unlikely.
Thank you very much, Abdulghani. And we'll get back to the South in a minute, but let me turn to Elana for a minute and ask you, Elana, for your view on the likelihood, or maybe not likelihood, but potential outcomes of a negotiation between the Hadi government and the Houthis, if it were to come to that. Can you kind of imagine for us what each side would be looking to achieve? What's their bottom line, and how likely it is they would be able to get in a negotiation?
Sure. First of all, I want to say thank you all for having me, and it's so wonderful to see so many faces here who are familiar, some of whom I see often, and some who I'm meeting for the first time but have known for a decade. So it's a really lovely crowd of people that care a lot about Yemen. So compliments to AGSIW for pulling together such a good audience. On the question of Hadi and the Houthis, so I actually think that there's basically two sets of negotiations that have to happen, the Hadi and Houthi negotiation, but also the Saudi-Houthi negotiation. And I agree entirely with what Abdulghani has said on so many different pieces and parts. In terms of and then separately, I guess a third one would be the Hadi-STC negotiations. Across all of those, there's a couple of patterns. So the Hadi government tends to stand on principle that they must be seen as the legitimate power. And so this has been a bit of a stumbling block on occasion for the UN because, certain things that require compromise, the Hadi government will not compromise on what it claims to be its legitimacy. And so, for example, won't agree to things like splitting central bank revenues or things like that. I think that also, as an example with the STC, the Hadi government has said, the STC has to withdraw from certain installations in order for us to talk with them directly. And so there haven't, to my knowledge, been direct talks, but more kind of a shuttle sort of talking. And so I think from the Hadi government perspective, their negotiating stance is we are the legitimate government, and if you want to negotiate with us, then you need to accept that. And so that is reflected in the talks with the STC, in the talks with the Houthis. And so I think that is ultimately their position overall. With regard to the Houthis, I think the things that they ultimately want are basically four things. First of all, they want to know that the border is secure in some way. So that is really a conversation more with the Saudis probably than with Hadi. They also want some sort of recognition. Now, that word can have so many different meanings, and I'm vague on purpose. I think the idea is that they want to just be included in some sort of government. What exactly the proportion of representation and all of that will need to be negotiated. But I think they want to be recognized as a part of the future of Yemen in some way. And I don't think that's any small thing. I mean, I don't think they expect the Saudis to come out and say, we recognize Zaydis, that, but they want some sort of recognition that that the Saudis and the Hadi government will allow them to exist. And I think they also want to ensure that their areas are no longer marginalized. So what that means is some sort of reconstruction in the north that will largely come from regional powers or UN groups as opposed to, say, the Hadi government because they don't have the money. And then fourth, they'd like the Salafism elements in the country to be lessened or gone or whatever. So I think there's that sort of element as well. And most of these things that I've just described are really things that they need to talk to the Saudis about more than the Hadi government. I think I think the plan for the future of Yemen is fairly clear, and I think all parties understand that at some point the idea is to get some sort of transitional government where, whether it's a presidential council or, there's some sort of structure where people from all the different sides are a part of that, and that lasts for some period of time, a year or 2 years, and then there's elections. And I think for the most part, everybody agrees that that's the ultimate plan, but getting there has been tricky because the Hadi government stands on principle and the issues I talked about. The Saudis have been stubborn in many ways as well. The Houthis have credibility issues, so there's all these issues on all the different sides that the UN is grappling with to try to even get them to the table. The last comment I'll make is I think the metaphor for the difficulties is really the fact that in Hodeidah, the parties meet on a ship. They don't even meet on land. They have to meet on a ship because they can't agree which parcel of land they can meet on. And so I think that's really metaphorically the struggle with even getting the parties to, we can't even decide on the table, let alone, what the conversation on the table is about.
Great, thanks, Elana. And Charles, Elana has referred to some of the different layers of negotiations that will have to take place, not just between the principal parties to the conflict, i.e. the Hadi government and Ansar Allah, but also you can imagine that the STC, the Marabis, Hadramis, you might find a lot of different layers, tribal layers, geographic, regional interests that might have competing interests in the outcome of this. So to what extent are they able to derail even a negotiation by just becoming spoilers, if you will, and making enough trouble so that the principal parties can't find a common ground that will allow them to meet each other's demands?
Well, this is a constant in Yemen. I mean, Yemen is, many factions at many different levels, and this is sort of part of Yemeni politics. I wouldn't think that would be a big obstacle. I do think that the primary negotiations are at the upper level. That when STC and Hadi government and Ansar Allah and various and Islah and the other factions, if they were able to come to agreement, that they could hold that. I mean, you would need someone else driving local parties to be able to disrupt that. I mean, so they just started exporting. They tried to export oil out of Marib, I think yesterday or so, and the trucks got a little ways and they got attacked and burned up. The idea was to bring them down to the pipeline, then send it to the port in Nushaima. So I mean, you can't even get the oil, even in a truck. But this is they will. I mean, eventually they will work it out. Somebody wanted something, so they'll make a deal. Those smaller conflicts, I don't think will be an obstacle to an overall agreement. I wouldn't think so. Okay. You need an outside actor to fund and drive before they can become a major obstacle.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Let me look then for a moment at you talk about driving parties in the negotiation. I've been very surprised, maybe naively, that the Houthis have been so forthcoming and have leaned forward in a very positively disposed way. I mean, they've released prisoners. They've made seems to be a serious offer to suspend their attacks, waiting for the Saudis to agree. The Saudis say they see it positively, but I'm not sure where this all stands. What is it that has made the Houthis so disposed? I mean, I would have thought the Houthis would have made life miserable for the Saudis at this point, given the fact that the UAE has removed a lot of its forces. They're not there. You're using Yemeni forces now. So basically the ground forces have been greatly diminished in the eyes of the Houthis. So why, Abdulghani, do you think the Houthis are leaning into this now in what appears to be a genuinely positive disposition?
They can speak with confidence now. They have won the war. For months, I've been telling the representatives of the internationally recognized government that when I came back to Sana'a, I realized how much the Houthis feel comfortable that they have won the war and they are now the successor state to whatever was represented by Hadi. So given the comfort zone that they are in, they can now make compromises. This is also supported by the fact that they have taken over the state institutions and reconstituted the northern Zaydi tribal elite that governed during the time of Saleh. So it is now, what we have now is Saleh's regime without Saleh. And as such, they have the technical and bureaucratic skills and the diplomatic skills of the old crew on their side, supporting them, enlightening them, teaching them how to negotiate, how to play politics. And because they are comfortable in their position, they are taking that advice and acting upon it. So the concessions they're making are a sign of their strength.
Elana, your thoughts?
Sure. So I think that the Houthis, there's two separate issues between the Hadi government and the Houthis with regard to negotiation. It's hard to get the Hadi government to the table for the reasons I suggested before. It's really easy to get the Houthis to the table, but then their credibility on things that they agree to is the hard part, right? So there's two separate issues here. So the UN is able to talk to the Houthis at length, and they've come up with all sorts of plans and thoughts and all sorts of things. They're having a harder time kind of getting started with the Hadi government, but I think once you have an agreement, then the concern becomes whether the Houthis will implement their pieces and parts of it. So for the Houthis, I think that they did the unilateral withdrawal from Hodeidah because they thought that if they did some sort of unilateral withdrawal, that would put pressure on the government to then have to do something in kind. They're also very frustrated about the prisoner release, that there hasn't been a prisoner release yet. Now, their point of view, I'm not in the talks, I can't confirm this, their point of view is we're willing to do prisoner releases in batches. The Hadi government wants to do it all at once, and we can't agree on every single last prisoner, so we can't even get started because it has to be an all or nothing. And so, I think for them, this ceasefire was meant as not only their attempt, but honestly the UN's attempt to put pressure on the Saudis and the Hadi government to get moving in some direction somehow. So the Houthis came out and said, we'll do a ceasefire for 3 weeks, a month, 6 weeks, whatever. Then that puts the Saudis in a position to are you going to also do it, or are you going to look like the bad guys? And so I think that was their move. I mean, now the Houthis have not done all good things. We talked about Qatar. We know about, they took credit for Upcake, which most of us don't believe is what happened. But, their messaging has not been all positive. But their view today is, we did a full ceasefire and Saudi still hasn't fully done it. There hasn't been a prisoner exchange. Sana'a airport is still not open. We did the unilateral withdrawal in Hodeidah. The fuel shipments are delayed. So we're giving all these things. What are we getting? And I think it's a really fragile point in time. The Houthis are being asked to be patient. I think the Saudis and the Hadi government are moving on some of these things, but shui, as we say, slowly. But I do think the Houthis are now starting to have a point of view of, are the Saudis actually serious? And this goes back to your comments about, are the Saudis actually serious in trying to get to peace? I think that's kind of where we stand today.
Great. On that issue of are the Saudis really serious, Charles, do you have a feeling that the Saudis do now want to get out of Yemen, or are they unable and unwilling to relinquish what they think is an essential control of that country to their south?
Clearly the Saudis would like to stop spending so much money and stop the damage and destruction, which is bad press for them. They will not relinquish their role in Yemen. There's just no way. But I don't think that that's actually not hard. I mean, Abdulghani mentioned there was an agreement in April 2016 where they came, the Houthi and the Saudis were so, if the Houthi, what the Houthi want are the bombing to stop and the blockade to end. This is what they would like. And the Saudis seem willing to give it to them as long as the Houthi are willing to deal with the Saudis to address Saudi issues. And that one is not all that hard.
Abdulghani, is it hard?
It's not hard, but there is one ingredient missing in this concoction, and that is how to bring the Saudis and the Ansar Allah to make the concessions that are required of them to present the Saudis as sponsors rather than combatants. And how could the Ansar Allah tell their base that after all this bombing, all the blood that has been shed, we're going to pretend that the Saudis did nothing, then to say Saudis are our big brother and they are going to come and make peace. So it's a matter of how to produce it. But to get to it, I mean, the idea is acceptable, I think, in both sides. They just need to find a way to produce it.
It seems like that's a kind of an invitation to ask, what is that? They need to produce it. What is, what is this missing link? If they're both disposed, what's holding them back? Is it domestic concerns? Are the Houthis constrained by, as you say, by their own population? Are there constituent issues that they have to get out here and sell it to their publics? Elaine, what do you think is the big obstacle here?
I think it's what Abdulghani said before. It's a face-saving way out. So for the Saudis, if they need some sort of way of framing, whatever the answer is, whatever kind of whatever form it takes, it needs to be something that is face-saving for them. And so what I worry about is I'm not sure if the leadership in Saudi thinks being the negotiator is equivalent to a face-saving way out. So I think that is the way. I've been calling since 2016 or 17 for the Saudis and the Houthis to talk to each other. And I've said, the Saudis would then be able to say, we single-handedly got Iran out of Yemen. Isn't that a huge win? I mean, that's what the newspaper can say, whether any of us think that that's exactly what happened or not, but that can be something face-saving. And so my question has been, why haven't the Saudis taken that? Why haven't they done that in the last 2 years? And it's a question I haven't been able to answer.
Charles?
Well, I'll try.
Give me the answer.
So I mean, it seems my reading of the breakdown of the 16 agreement was that Ali Abdullah Saleh got in the role because he didn't like he wanted to use Ansar Allah to become head again. He miscalculated, of course, but that and therefore an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Ansar Allah wasn't in his interest. So he scuttles that one. But what we're leaving out of this, the interests of Saudi Arabia, the interests of the Houthi. We can see how that can work. It's mostly the security, but then we can work that out. But then there's the rest of Yemen. What about the rest of Yemen? And Saudis sponsor the rest of Yemen. Yemen, Saudi is, and that's much more difficult. I've always thought that the much more difficult one is how to deal with the Hadi government, STC, and the Houthi. So a lot of people have said that the Houthi are good at war, but terrible at peace. In other words, they know how to do an insurgency. They've been fighting insurgency. They've been fighting wars for a long time. They know how to mobilize people for a war, but they don't know how to rule. What's going to be the basis of the rule? Now, Abdulghani is saying that, well, they've reconstituted the Saleh state, and I'm very curious about this. I'm very curious about. It's clear to me that in the tribal regions they've done very well. They know what they're doing. They've done very well in the tribal regions. What I'm curious about is the role of the Sada. What's happening with the Sada? Because they've been given a privileged role, and what are they going to do with that? And then the rest of Yemen absolutely rejects this. I mean, what's going to be the basis of Yemen? So I always say, look, in 68, 70, we had a similar sort of war chaos, the whole country apart. But coming out of it, we had a common idea of a Republican government, and we had an economic boom next door. Mm-hmm. This time, we don't have a common Republican government. I mean, what's going to be the basis? What are we all here for? And worse, the next door is falling apart. I mean, there's no economy now. It's a far more difficult situation this time, I think, than in 68, 70.
Well, this raises an interesting question about the Houthis themselves and their organizational complexities, because there certainly seems to be a certain amount of division between the political leadership, the public face, the negotiating face of the Houthis, and then you have the rank and file on the ground, the guys with the AKs and the guns and the checkpoints who are living quite well. And they may see this as detrimental to their interests. So, I mean, can the Houthis, you say the Houthis get knocked because they can't govern, they sure can fight. How do you make that switch? How do they somehow reconcile whatever internal divisions they have and come back to speak with a single voice that can be relied upon in negotiations to be able to be a single voice that'll unify that movement and give it a position that negotiators on the other side can count on being steadfast. Please, someone anyway.
The divisions within the Ansar Allah ranks are huge, but they are masked by ideological discipline. And when people, so it's Abdul Malik al-Houthi that's bringing them together. But when I presented that on another occasion, somebody said, so if Abdul Malik al-Houthi is assassinated, then they will break apart? No, because the loyalty is not to the person, it's to the office of al-Wali al-Alam, the ultimate religious leader of the Zaydi sect. And so if they kill Abdul Malik al-Houthi, another person will come and take the place and gain the same kind of loyalty and obedience. Therefore, it is important for us to recognize that if the Houthis commit to an agreement, because of this discipline, despite all the divisions within the ranks, they will actually be in a position to honor it. And I can say that about the internationally recognized government because it is divided and they don't have wali alam. They have no leader. As for the Saudis, I believe from past experience in negotiating with them that they do honor their agreements. If they commit, they actually honor their agreements. So the question is going to be in getting the internationally recognized government to actually get to the point where they can become a credible partner in agreement.
To get the Saudis to the point where they'll be a credible partner.
The Saudis to get the internationally recognized government because they are
The
the
Hadi
ones who are
government.
going
Right.
to sign. The Hadi government.
Understood.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Charles, please.
Well, yeah, I would just second that. I mean, the reason that the Hadi government so clings to 2216, UN Resolution 2216, is because it recognized them. Mm-hmm. But they have, in terms of a government, they have zero legitimacy. They call themselves legitimate government because it's oxymoron. I mean, they have no legitimacy whatsoever. So Ali Muqsin is sitting with, Islah and Marib, which is sort of an independent state over there, and they look sort of askance at Hadi. And the Hadramis have their own agendas, which are separate from Hadi. There are parts of Abiyan, and this is where he's drawing his ranks. So the what's it called, the interior minister and whatnot, they're all coming from Abiyan, but even in Abiyan, they don't control the ground. There's so they have no legend. So it's true, they can't negotiate. They can't, as opposed to Ansar Allah that can honor an agreement, put together an agreement, and organize something. Hadi can't organize anything, and it's a real problem. That's a serious problem, and it's an obstacle to any kind of a real resolution.
On that note, Hadi's power comes from those resolutions. Mm-hmm. So when I mentioned before about standing on principle, I don't mean that it comes across as a negative. It's usually what we accuse other people of, stop standing on principle and that kind of thing. But I mean that is the standing that Hadi has, as a principled standing, as opposed to a base of support, a military. Let's not forget that the Houthis took over much of the military when Saleh was around and kind of gave it to them, in 2014-15. So like Hadi doesn't have military power to defeat the Houthis without the Saudis or the Emiratis, and he doesn't have a legitimate, population base of people who are behind him. So the thing he has is that principled legitimacy, we are the government thing, and so he cannot give that up in a negotiation. And so that, I think, explains why there's that kind of standing on principle. Couldn't agree more.
And it would seem as though that there is no real enthusiasm in the UN to try to bring forward a new UNSCR. So 2216 remains, in fact, in place. I'm not sure you could get one through the Security Council if you wanted to. But therefore, Hadi's position as the legitimate, if you will, ruler of Yemen seems to be pretty much assured for the time being. Is that your assessment?
That I think you summed it up. Do you guys agree?
I'd like to disagree on this. For the longest time, the UN Security Council Resolution 2216
2216.
has been an obstacle to peace because it placed a bar that is so high for the Ansar Allah to go to negotiations. And actually has created false balance between the internationally recognized government and the de facto authorities that have full control over state institutions, majority of the population, and military force. I think that maintaining the line of legitimacy is extremely important. If we lose it, we could possibly lose the Yemeni state, but that shouldn't be at the cost of everything. So either legitimacy is transferred in a proper way to a different mechanism that then makes 2216 unnecessary, or we have to consider the possibility of losing legitimacy when legitimacy continues to be an obstacle in the way of peace.
Yeah,
Charles.
I would see though that, and I think it's been floated where you have Hadi as figurehead, head of state, and you have a transitional government that's a real transitional government that the parties have really come together upon, and that's a way of skirting 2216. I agree, 2216 was a big mistake, but I do think that there are not that difficult ways of getting around it. If you had a real political process, so if Ansar Allah is really talking to SDC, is really talking to the Hadramis, is really talking to Ali Muqsin, and they can come to an agreement, then you can have Hadi as head of state, but figuratively, and then the real political power being in some transitional governance council of some sort. Yeah.
Well, you've just dangled a very enticing prospect, which is all these supporters are going to come together and talk to each other. Ansar Allah is going to talk to the STC. Now, this goes back to something that Abdulghani suggested earlier, which is for the moment, it's best to let the STC stay pat in Aden, let it control affairs of the South, because to do otherwise would just invite more conflict and more chaos. At the same time, the flip of that coin would be, doesn't that also provide greater legitimacy for the STC to establish itself as a regional authority, not necessarily inclined to get together with others to try to strike a deal at any point? How problematic would that be?
The STC should control a good part, the majority of the population of the South, which is its demographic base, but not be the sole representative of the South. Because Hadi is also from the South, and we have in the internationally recognized government about 70% of the top leadership, military and civilian, from the South. But they're all from Abyan and Shabwa, from Hadi's side of the South. So even when they controlled 70% of the top positions in the national government, the South was still underrepresented because of this imbalance. So I think that it's possible for them for STC to sit on the table and be reasonable and rational in seeking some degree of autonomy within a unified Yemen. That's really, I think that's really the ceiling, the real ceiling of their negotiations. They used the idea of secession to excite the street and to fire the street, but they know that they will negotiate for autonomy within a federal state.
Mm-hmm. So this then raises the question of what does this example of the STC in Aden and the South suggest to, as you said earlier, Charles, the authorities in Marib, who are quite independent now of the central authority in Sana'a, and the Hadramis, and maybe the Mahris, who are looking increasingly as though they want to get away from Saudi Arabia and those claws digging into them and maybe go closer to Oman. How does this example reflect and implicate the behavior of other regions of Yemen? If you're looking at a unified federal state of some sort, Is federalism possible, or are they going to insist on something more than that? That goes to anyone who wants to raise their hand. Thank you, Charles.
Well, I would say to that is that to some extent everybody's tied together economically, and that they need. There is a huge economic crisis, right? I mean, the Arab Spring comes just as the revenues are, going to collapse, and they do collapse, and the war, of course, precipitates it. And there is, of course, a little bit more oil, but oil can't be relied upon. There is a major rebuilding of infrastructure to be done. There is a need to rebuild the economic basis of Yemen. It's a huge task in front of them. And if Marib can't go separate, Marib makes its money off of Sana'a. I mean, everything's going through Marib to go to Sana'a. They know this, right? And Aden as well. Aden is tied to the rest of Yemen. It can't sort of succeed and not have relations. They know they're going to have to deal with one another. And I think along the lines of the SDC, yes, they call for secession all the time, but I think they're pretty much aware that much of the rest of the South is not with them. And even in Lahij, there are strong parties that oppose succession. So, I think we're hoping rationally here, aren't we? We're putting hopes, but I think there is
we can in this room. It's okay.
I think there is a strong impetus for everyone once we've sort of given up on our war, and we've gotten more or less the political positions that we want, that we're going to have to deal with each other to put together an economy of some sort.
Linda, how do you see those kind of centrifugal forces affecting the center?
So, I mean, in my experience, although Yemen has a huge population, everybody seems to know each other, and so every time, when I went to Muscat recently, and the same person that set up my meetings with the Houthis set up my meetings with the Mahris, and the Mahris and Houthis don't actually at that time know each other, whatever, but like the same, it's just a funny kind of world, and the STC does talk to all of these people, the STC and the Mahris who are protesting the Saudi presence and really don't like the STC do talk to each other. And the AQAP and the Houthis did a prisoner exchange a few weeks ago. And so you can take these, mortal enemies and they do work with each other. And I think that, I've always thought that that's something quite wonderful about Yemenis. One of the things, there's all these stories that I'm sure Abdulghani could give you 10 examples of, so-and-so's brother is the governor of such and such, but then his cousin is on the opposite side negotiating the prisoner releases for the other party or whatever. And I think using these sorts of things to our benefit and allowing to some degree, I say allowing as if it's up to us, but, just kind of allowing Yemenis to do things the way that they've always done them to some degree. I think you're right that sort of letting things lie a little bit sometimes allows groups to kind of work things out among themselves. So this idea that all the different groups in Yemen should talk to each other, I would just suggest I totally agree, but I also think it's already happening to some degree. And it's the outside powers coming in that complicates this situation quite a bit.
Just out of curiosity, because I haven't heard about it lately, is the United States meeting with the Houthis? Did that ever transpire?
Yeah. So my understanding just from the public reporting is that we know that Assistant Secretary David Schenker came out and confirmed that story, which was first reported in the Wall Street Journal. But whether those talks are actually, my understanding is there was some set of talks that were supposed to happen, and it didn't. And I think the Houthis declined because there had been an airstrike. I think the one on the prison or something. I might be mixing up my dates, but I don't think it's in the public knowledge as to whether it's actually literally happening now. I don't know if you guys know. Yeah.
I haven't heard much about it to confirm one way or the other.
The impetus is there. The desire is there.
Right. And then let me just kind of use that as a way to get into a little bit of a look into where we think the UN Special Envoy's efforts are at the moment. Because I understand that Martin Griffiths is encouraged by some of these latest developments and maybe sees this as a way to kind of re-energize, if you will, rejuvenate his mission, which, again, seems to be focused still on Hodeidah when the locus of most of the action has moved very much from Hodeidah to Aden and to Taiz and to Marib and elsewhere. So, Abdulghani, you're in Hodeidah. Is that still that kind of the Stockholm Agreement framework that's still kind of hanging together by paper clips, but still together? Is there a movement away from that? Can it be? Can that actually be sustained, or does that need constant care and attention while the rest of the country goes on about its business?
Unfortunately, the Hodeidah Agreement is a very fragile flower and needs constant attention. But we cannot implement the full text of the agreement. The great success of the agreement is that it is still alive. It still is being observed by the parties. The ceasefire is not violated in a big way. There are now there are joint patrols taking place. And I think that Hodeidah is the gate to a peace agreement, to a nationwide cessation of hostilities agreement. It sets the ground for that. It states the terms of engagement. If we lose it, then we'll have to negotiate from the start. So the fact that it is still recognized and observed until now is, in my view, a great success, and I think that the mission and the UN system in general are working very hard to keep it going. As far as the options of the special envoys the envoy are concerned, I think that the UN is the special mission, special political mission, and the envoy are a tool for the stakeholders to use to engage with each other. The special envoy cannot really exceed that role by much. If the Saudis have made up their mind on what they want to do, then they can use that tool. If they don't want to use it, then that tool will become useless.
Elana, you kind of had a sense of how the envoy's office is feeling about its mission.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is, I suspect the UN would love to move beyond Hodeidah in the sense that Hodeidah was meant to be a confidence building, measure. So we come to this agreement, we show that we can all trust each other, and then we can move to bigger things. And I agree with Abdulghani that the fact that it still exists is the win, and I think it should continue to exist. But I do sense, frustration that perhaps we could move, to something larger. And it seems as though that's happening by consequence of, the Houthi ceasefire, which allows Martin's team to now be focused on, negotiations with regard to that. I don't think the UN team is technically part of the STC talks because it's not in their mandate exactly. But I think that situation in the South has stirred things up in such a way that maybe it's given some space for the envoy to kind of move out of the Hodeidah box and into something, keep working on that, but also do a couple other things. And I would lastly add that I mean, this is my view, kind of looking from outside, but I think the Abqaiq attack in Saudi Arabia really stirred up the Saudis a bit and has led to, there's been some movement on the Saudi side of negotiations that didn't exist before. I mean, as all of us are saying, 2016 was such a good moment. Can we get back to that in some way? And it seems as though there is, although it's like glacially slow, there is some movement. So I think these three things have kind of shaken things up enough to kind of give maybe a little bit more life into the UN process. At least we hope so.
And just to go back for a second to my earlier question about the U.S. engagement with the Houthis, because there was a larger question there, which is what should the U.S. role be in this business? I mean, you read a lot that suggests, the U.S. should be more active in Floyd's diplomacy, get more engaged, and push the Saudis and push whomever, and really use the clout of our diplomacy, which has been so diminished of late. I can't imagine we can muster the resources. Maybe we can. Should we, I guess, is the question. And will it have the desired effect? Charles, any thoughts on what you'd like to see the U.S. do in this?
Well, I mean, Yeah, I mean, how can? Well, never mind.
That's my
I mean,
feeling
we're
exactly.
Really feel.
Washington's so debilitated. How can it possibly, lead anything? So,
We can't run ourselves.
no, no, but I would say, well, yeah. So Putin was just in Saudi Arabia, big welcome, blah blah, and people talk about, oh well, the Russians are now coming and they're playing this big role, and there was some $2 billion weapons deal that was announced or something like that, but somebody pointed out that the U.S. supplied some $30 billion in weapons. I mean, the U.S.'s role is still huge in Saudi Arabia. And so, I mean, yes, there would be the possibility that the Americans could play a role, and it would be largely sort of pushing the Saudis in a direction to, and then in the reconstruction efforts, of course, aiding in the international agencies to reconstruct Yemen and whatnot. But you have to have coherent policy.
Yeah.
I'll just add a thought to that, and I'm curious about whether Abdulghani agrees with me or not. But when I speak to some of the Houthis, I get the sense that many of them think the U.S. is behind the war. There's this kind of thought process that ultimately it's part of an American conspiracy and that kind of thing, and that as a result, us getting involved in negotiations is the real answer, and also that, to some degree, if we snap our fingers, the Saudis will do what we tell them to do. So now, I don't think those things are true, but if there's a segment of the Houthi leadership that does think that's true, is it possible that we could play upon that a bit by just entering into talks? They might think there is some sort of movement happening, or can we give credibility to larger negotiations as a result of that? I'm sort of dancing around this idea because I'm kind of telling you my own questions out loud, but it's something that struck me when I talked to some of them, that these themes sort of come up over and over. When Trump did the veto 2 months ago or so, there was a whole set of conversations about see, the Americans really are behind the war because they could have stopped it and they chose not to, even though all of us that understand D.C. knew the congressional resolutions were never going to get past a Trump veto. But they didn't know that. And it was an interesting kind of set of conversations that reflected their sort of view of how the U.S.'s role in the war. Anyway, I leave that to comment by others, perhaps.
Abdulghani, you want to start with the comments?
Yes, please. To start with, I think there are many small things that the U.S. can do. While they may have to defer to Saudi Arabia on most issues, they can at least correct them when they make the most obvious mistakes. The same goes for the UAE. For example, right now, the Emiratis consider Islah to be the enemy. They're pushing Islah to the lap of both the extreme part to extremist groups and the moderates towards the unilateral negotiations with Ansar Allah. Either way, it's counterproductive. They should differentiate between the moderates and the extremists in Islah. Isolating Islah, this is just as bad as keeping the STC out of negotiations. Isolating Islah has legitimate claim to representation of a large demographic bloc, and isolating it will create some degree of instability. The U.S. can maybe help the Saudis make decisions with regards to negotiating with Ansar Allah. Right now, the Saudis are maybe waiting for something to come from Pakistan or from Iraq or whatever to negotiate through Iran, because the Saudis feel that if they strike a deal with Iran is a worthy opponent. They will not be conceding the war to Ansar Allah. this is a huge mistake. You push Ansar Allah to the lap of the Iranians. If they negotiate directly with Ansar Allah, then they bring them towards Saudi Arabia. If they negotiate through Iran, they push Ansar Allah to the lap of Iran. You know, things like this, these interventions are within the realm of possibility for U.S. diplomats.
Just briefly, is it your sense that the view of Islah and the difference between the way the Saudis view it and the Emiratis view it is one of the major wedges between the two states?
No, it's a secondary wedge. Now, you're getting me to a very uncertain territory. The difference between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia is huge. They are at opposite directions in the Yemen conflict. That's the overall view. If I am to comment on what the Emiratis think their role is, I will quote one of them who said that we came into this conflict to support Saudi Arabia and implement the UN resolution of restoring the Yemeni state and so on. Should we fail in restoring a unified Yemeni state, then we will seek to establish a southern state, and then we'll make sure to maintain the unity and territorial integrity of the southern state. And that's what they have been doing. They have been working to ensure that if Yemen breaks apart, that the STC will have a reasonable chance of maintaining the unity of the South. The Saudis do not agree on that. They have a different purpose. And I'll just cite what they have done in the past, and maybe then we can project it on their current behavior and in the future. In 1994, the Saudis supported the Yemen Socialist Party, of which I'm a member, to secede the South from unified Yemen. And there is every indication that they agreed with the leadership of YSP that once that happens, then Hadramaut will declare its independence from the South, then will become either a satellite state of Saudi Arabia or become some special arrangement for the Saudis to secure access to the Indian Ocean and avoid the Strait of Hormuz. And that was the purpose of them funding the secessionist movement in 1994. Since then, they had negotiated with the government to gain that access. But every time they start the negotiation, the Saudis say, but we want full sovereignty over the corridor, meaning that they have to divide Yemen into two pieces. That was impossible for Saleh to accept that. I know that this demand was on the table in 1997, 2003. I think that the US and the Emirates both disagree with the Saudi designs, because I think that they believe that Saudi Arabia, not relying on the security umbrella provided by the US, while they are suffering from this stranglehold in Hormuz Strait, Saudi Arabia will become too hegemonic on its neighbors, and for the US will become too independent, and maybe will then establish some kind of strategic links with China, with Russia, to the detriment of US military-industrial complex. So I think that the disagreement on Islah is a secondary issue that the UAE has amplified to mask its true intentions of being in the south, specifically to frustrate Saudi designs.
Before we go to questions, I'll invite either one of you want to.
Just a little bit on
Yeah.
that. I mean, what's interesting to me, the last statement about Islah. I mean, the STC, there is a domestic agreement as well. It's not just a pawn of sort of international of the UAE and the Saudis fighting. I mean, Islah is painted in the south. Because of the war in 1994, they were seen as northerners and as fifth columnists and all this kind of stuff. And so they have a bad name in the south, which is one of the reasons the Salafis do much better in the south, because they are an alternative to Islah. The other thing I would just say quickly on it is the UAE. The UAE and the Saudis have very different security interests in the region as well. For the Saudis, the Yemen is a serious, this big long border, so it's a serious security threat. For the UAE, it's not so big, and their interests are maritime, much more maritime, and so they're interested in securing the ports and the coasts and whatnot. And Yemen doesn't represent a direct security threat to them to the degree that it does to Saudi Arabia. So there's some background differences as well.
I would suggest that the way that I lived in the UAE for 6 years and worked with Emiratis quite a bit. And the way that I would describe their view of the Muslim Brotherhood or Islah in Yemen as an extension of that, in their view, is the way that many people in America viewed communism. This idea that if even a drop of this gets into our society, all of the functions of our society will slowly be degraded and we will end up as XYZ. And so the same idea is here, that if even a drop of Muslim Brotherhood / Islah gets into, any other country in the region, then the underpinnings of, our region, the stability of the region in their view will be undercut in some fundamental major way. And so that's how the UAE views the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis don't view it quite that way. So in the way that I would say, and this is a little bit of a it's not a perfect analogy, but I would say the way that the UAE views the Muslim Brotherhood, the strength of their view is similar to Saudi's view of Iran. So I would say they're opposites on this. So the UAE views the Muslim Brotherhood as the biggest threat, and Iran is a pretty big threat too. And the Saudis view Iran as the biggest threat, and the Muslim Brotherhood as a pretty big threat too. And so they agree but disagree. And they disagree on tactics and methods and all sorts of things. And I think this is all played out in Yemen, to where the Saudis are singularly focused on, the Houthis, and the UAE's like, oh, right, and them. And the UAE is singularly focused on these, what they perceive as Islahi issues in the south. And, oh, by the way, right, the Houthi, and the Saudis don't pay as close attention to that as they have to the Houthis. So that's my sort of very just kind of quick cut, not perfect, but analogy that I would throw out as a way to think about it.
Well, great. Extraordinary insights. Let me now open the floor up for questions, if I may. I'll ask you to please identify yourselves. We have microphones in the back, and we have two questions, one to this gentleman here, and then over in the corner over here to Hannah. And we'll come to you next.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. There's a big picture element missing here. For hundreds of years, Iran has wanted to take control of the holy places. It's no accident that it's called the Quds Force. And to have the opportunity to establish a base on the Saudi border is a gift directly from Allah. So Iran wants to Hezbollize the Houthis. And until that is broken, all of this is magical thinking.
Okay. Any sense of Iran's designs in Yemen from anyone here who would be?
I remember when we were talking about the role of Iran during the Saada Wars, and everybody said that they are behind the Saada Wars, which was clearly a false reading of the situation. I used to say that the Saudis keep saying this, and this is going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it hasn't quite become that's self-fulfilling prophecy, because until now, Ansar Allah have managed to establish at least a degree of independence from Iran, despite their increasing reliance on Iran as the war drags on, and they require more sophisticated technology, they require petroleum products, subsidies, etc. But the Iranians have also given many signals that Yemen is a card that has fallen in their lap with very little effort on their part, and they are just as eager to trade it in for something more durable somewhere else. So there are those ideologists in Iran who think, as you have suggested, Mr. Humphrey, but I think the establishment has acted on a totally different basis.
Any other thoughts? If not, we'll move on. Okay, question over here from Hannah, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah Porter. I'm an independent analyst focused on Yemen. Thank you for this wonderful panel. It's been very informative. So my primary question is, can we speak a little bit more about the Jeddah talks that have been taking place and the things that have been revealed in the past few days? So Al Jazeera had supposedly leaked a draft agreement a few days ago, and it includes provisions that I would imagine are completely unacceptable to the STC. And now there's news saying that the agreement will be signed before the end of the week. So it seems like there's a lot happening very fast, and I'm just wondering, will this agreement actually take place? If so, what do you expect the provisions to be, and what are the consequences for the STC, the UAE, and other parties involved? Thank you.
Great question. Charles, please.
Yeah. So the leak said that the STC would take some ministerial positions in the government, and that the armed forces would come together under Yemeni Hadi, military commanders, blah, blah, blah. The STC basically surrenders. There was then another leak from an STC source that said that Saudi Arabia would recognize the STC, that Hadi would stay out, that blah, 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 right? So we don't know what's in that agreement. Who knows? There may not be an agreement. There was an announcement that they were going to sign it. Zubaydi has left. He's headed to I think he must be there by now. Then now they're not going to sign it. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, come on, it's only been a month. We've got lots of time to work things out. There will be some sort of there must be a political resolution of that. I think everybody knows that. But what's the shape going to be? It may take longer than the date was tomorrow, but so it may take longer than that. And I suspect that it will. And I do suspect that the SDC will maintain control of Aden. I don't see them. I mean, they're not going to give that up. I think that'll be part of the agreement. But I wouldn't worry about it being canceled and put off for another month. I mean, got to work things out.
Elana, please.
I couldn't agree more. I would just add a couple of just thoughts about what people care about in this kind of agreement. So the first is, and I believe Abdulghani mentioned this before, Hadi would want, if it ends up being something like half the Hadi government is Southerners and half are Northerners, or some arrangement like that. Hadi doesn't want it to be an agreement with the STC. He wants it to be an agreement with Southern parties. So that would mean, it wouldn't, I suspect the agreement, at least from his view, if he gets what he wants, it would not say the STC gets XYZ. It would say, Southern representatives get XYZ. And that could include Fadi Baum, and that could include Ali Nasser and all these other folks who are pro-unity. So I think that's kind of, from Hadi's point of view, the thing that he cares most about. The armed forces piece, I mean, the Southerners becoming part of Hadi's military, I mean, aren't they already technically legally? So, what does that mean? So when I was in Aden in June, Abu Yamama and Shalal Shaya, who both work for Hadi, sat in the STC meeting in their Hadi government uniforms with their, Southern flag. So, I think what exactly that means is a question. And then in terms of recent news, the UAE has redeployed out of Aden a bit, taking some Sudanese with them. And my understanding is some of the Saudis are coming in to backfill that. So there's some movement happening that I suspect is part of kind of a higher level arrangement to kind of try to push things in some sort of direction. But I totally agree that like whether it happens tomorrow or a week from now, or I think it's all sort of in flux, and even the parties themselves don't actually really know what's gonna happen. Yeah.
Okay. Gentleman right here, and then we'll go to Mimi. In the second row here, Jose.
I have
Thank
a couple of questions, but before, I want my dear friend Abdulghani to reconsider into issues. One, that the secessionists in Aden represent majority. This is not true. They represent majority on only 3 or 4 counties. And they exercise force against the rest, and the people in Aden fearful of them because they have past experience, and how can they be treated by this type of groups? They have 20 years or more of experience, or 30 years. This is one point. I think you should be reconsidering in that. The other point is that if the Emirate wanted the decision to, the separation to be a last resort, if the unity of the country failed, this is not evidence. There is no evidence on that. The Emirate from day one planned to dismantle the country. And every act it did was in that direction. And the third point, which is a question, is that I think we looked to the negotiation between Houthi and Saudi Arabia in a very simplistic way, as if it is independent of the dynamics and balances within the country. If they are going to negotiate directly, negotiate about what? The interest of Saudi Arabia lies in arranging internal, balances in Yemen that will enable Saudi Arabia to keep Yemen at least independent of external influence. And therefore, negotiation between the Houthi and Saudi Arabia is not just a matter of face, keeping or whatever. It is a process that cannot be without really a general equilibrium outlook to the dynamics in Yemen and probably beyond.
Now, I'm going to give you a chance to quickly add a question to that if you'd like to. Then we're going to move on.
Okay.
Okay. You want a question?
I still have a question.
Quickly, then, please.
What is then the crossroad between what and what? And what is the picture of the sustainable peace? And how can we discuss the bits and pieces without really relating them to the sustainable peace and its outlook and the process and dynamics that will get us there? Maybe alternative ones.
Okay.
But you cannot discuss bits and pieces here and there and reach conclusion on where they're going to go and these pieces without really linking them to the overall picture of the peace itself or the process that will take there.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure I heard a question there, but maybe there's something, Charles, you'd like to...
Well, I could, on the last issue, so the peace comes from political negotiations and compromise. But the country went to war when parties felt their security was threatened. When parties feel that their security, therefore, is not threatened, then the negotiations can begin. I would say that's the key point. The overall picture is the building of a new transitional political process, right? But what's prevented that has been security needs, and we're beginning to see perhaps the parties begin to work out their various fears and security fears. So maybe this is a beginning.
Abdulghani, since you were asked to reconsider a few of your positions, have you done so?
Yes, I have.
Have you left the Socialist Party?
On the matter of being secessionist, I'm talking about a demographic bloc that is represented by STC. That demographic bloc does not necessarily ascribe to everything this STC is calling for, but we have done, the UN has done polling several times in the south, and there is a clear majority, vast majority, who want restoration of the old southern state. We have done multiple polls, so we speak with confidence that the prevailing sentiment in the south is pro-secession. There is a solid minority of about 30 to 40% in some governorates who are pro-unity. But I stand by that. As far as the UAE is concerned, I agree with you that the UAE has been working on Plan B much more than they have done on working on Plan A. The assumption, I think, is that Plan A is something that the Saudis are working on, so let's focus on our Plan B. But they have...
Not complementary.
They are contradictory, but basically Plan A, as far as the Emiratis are concerned, maintaining united Yemen is an acceptable option for them. And if it doesn't succeed, then maintaining united South would be the objective. As far as the peace is concerned, the sustainable peace, that's for us to negotiate, really, as Seche said. But I think that the one point I want to make in this regard is that ending the war comes before making the peace. And I think everybody, including the mission, the UN mission, are working to end the war. And let's talk about the peace later. It would be nice to do both, but given the limitations, I think at least we need to stop the war first.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go here to Mimi, and I'm going to go to Mohammed. Please, Jose, here in the front row from Ms. Burke.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mimi Burke from Brownstein Hyatt. We represent Saudi Arabia. It's a government relations firm. We'd like to represent UAE, and we're not interested in representing Iran. But I do have a question for you about the local populations and if they are backing their governments, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, in what their government is doing in Yemen.
I'll speak about Saudi Arabia because I have some idea, and I think Elana will speak about the Emirates. The Saudi population is not informed. Most of the Saudis I meet do not understand and do not wish to know what the government is doing in Yemen. So it's not in the area of their concern, immediate concern, and they're not informed. But opposition, Saudi opposition and diaspora have been very critical of the Saudi intervention in Yemen.
With the UAE, it's slightly complicated. Of course, we don't know in the sense that I can't say 65% believe this and that, but it's a relatively small population. In my experience there, they're largely supportive of their leadership. The thing that bothers Emiratis is when Emiratis are killed. And, as much as any other human being in the world, a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen as well. I think the UAE has, drawn down, I would say, not quite withdrawn, but drawn down in Yemen, in part because I think that they tried to take Houthi and they were talked out of that. And at some point they were like, well, what are we still doing here? I think it's also in part because of congressional, pressure here in D.C. But I also think it's probably because there's a timeline for how long they can stay engaged in something before their own population starts to really ask some questions. The Emiratis have taken the highest casualties that they've ever taken, in Yemen. I was there when I don't remember the exact number, but 50-some Emiratis were killed was it 60, in Marib. And that was really tough. I mean, the whole country went into mourning. And so those are the kinds of things that I think the leadership of the UAE, I mean, it's not so obvious as like there's all of a sudden protests in the street and then the leader decides to pull out of Yemen. I don't think it's quite like that. I think it's more nuanced, that the leadership knows they keep a finger on the pulse. And so I do think that part of the reason the UAE has pulled out, or at least an incentive to do so, is to kind of make sure that they are engaged in things that their own population is, continues to be supportive of.
Okay. Mohammed. What about Iran? It may be a little bit hard to get that insight into Iran. I don't know if we haven't. Well, that's be the next panel, Mimi. Okay, we'll get on that one. Okay. All right, we have a question here for.
Mine is very simple. Looking at what happened the past 5 years, what do you forecast?
We're going to put the mic anyway, just because we can use it for.
So my name is Mohammed Al-Basha with the Navanti Group. So my question is, looking at what happened in Yemen the past 5 years, can you give us your forecast for the next 5 years? And please be.
I feel like you should answer your.
No. You're going to help me with an assignment.
No, you can't do that. Anyone who's watched Yemen for even a short time will know that would be a very foolish thing to do. I mean, whoever saw Ali Darsalak allying with the Houthi to take over Sana'a? I mean, no one saw that except for him. You can't see that. I mean, I can see Yemen Somaliizing. I can see it not working out. I can see conflict continuing and just more disaster, and it becomes a Somalia as each group tries to maintain its control over a different area, And who knows? It could turn around, and you could see a thriving economy in 5 years. One hopes, but never. You can never. How do I say? Yemen will surprise you. I can just say that. So, predicting the future would be very foolish.
I always say that the way to understand Yemen is to not think about common interests, but to think of common adversaries. So the way that you understand why groups are aligned with each other, whether it's Saleh and the Houthis or any number of other, strange bedfellows, is that there's some sort of common adversary. And at the point at which the adversary disappears, there are no common interests oftentimes, and those two groups themselves become adversaries. We've seen this with the STC and the Hadi government against the Houthis, right? So I would just suggest that I think the one thing we can predict for the next 5 years is, as you said, it will continue to surprise us, and I think that sort of way of thinking about Yemen will probably still remain true.
And we have a question in the back, I believe. Abdulghani, please, I'm sorry.
Give us the answer.
Yeah, I was going to. Is that what you want?
Barring surprises, I think that we are progressing towards a peace agreement, which would mean only cessation of hostilities. There will be, at the national level, there will be warlords all over the place, divisions, and violence will be present in many places. And I think that any agreement will, at most, keep the pieces as they are. And I use the metaphor of Yemen has been hit by a truck, and the first thing you need to do is stop the bleeding, then make sure that you don't break anything, wait for the ambulance to come and pick up the patient. That's what will happen. So the various groupings will continue to control their territories while slowly negotiating for some kind of national agreement.
Great. Thank you. All right, question in the back then, please. I can.
Thank you so much. My question is to Abdulghani. This is Fatima, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. I wanted to, you spoke about ending the war, and people have different definitions of what the war is in Yemen. So the part of the challenge is the Houthis' conflicts with the multiple, groups on the ground, not just the government of Yemen, but the SDC, the Islah blocs, etc. I want to know how possible is for the Houthis to reconcile with these groups. How can they actually reconcile with these groups? And second, can you also speak to the impediments or possibilities within the Islah party to actually I mean, how much are they? How much are they a roadblock in terms of achieving peace in Yemen?
I think that one reason I'm suggesting that each group stays in its territory and slowly negotiate a national settlement is because of the kind of feuds that have been created by the conflict. And the Houthis have antagonized lots of people, and therefore you can't expect them to suddenly join together and form a national army and unified security apparatus, etc. As far as Islah is an obstacle to peace, I don't think so. I think Islah is a representative, just one of many representatives of the various demographic blocks that constitute Yemen. And you can't ignore them. You can't give them more representation than the real organic demographic block, which is a good part of the lower Yemen Sunni population.
Elana or Charles, any thoughts on that?
I would just add that I think that the obstacles to peace are individuals rather than overall parties, and I think Fatima, you know this better than I do probably, but there's is Islah overall an obstacle, or the GPC or the STC or the Houthis, or perhaps not, but there are certain individuals who are in a certain position or whatever. They perhaps are making money off the war, perhaps they want to keep their powerful position, perhaps their salaries more than they ever made before, whatever the reason. They are obstacles, but I wouldn't pin it on a particular party necessarily. I think there's just certain individuals who are benefiting in ways that allow them to be spoilers.
All right. Well, with that, I think we have exhausted our time. Thank you all for such a rich and textured conversation. I really do appreciate it. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you again.